this video, I wanted to try something a little bit different. So, as you guys may or may not know, I work as a database consultant. I usually work for about somewhere between 5 to 7 different clients at any one point in time. And I get a lot, one of the advantages of that is I get a lot of exposure to a lot of different problems. So, I thought it'd be neat to kind of go through some of the stuff that I went through over the past week or so. So the first problem I wanted to go over was this read-only routing problem I was trying to solve with SQL Server availability group. So if you've got an availability group, normally you have at least a primary and a secondary, and it's nice to try and route sessions that are only trying to read from the database to the replica. And there's a way to do that. You can route them. And what you can do is when connections come in, you just have to declare that your application intent is read only. And what should happen if you get everything configured correctly is that they should be routed to the secondary. And when you run queries, it'd be placing a load on the secondary instead of the primary. And that's a good idea if you've got someone who's just trying to do some ad hoc queries or something like that. And in this case, we're trying to get this working, and someone reported that, hey, I'm setting this correctly, but when I run the add@server server name, which is this command right here, it's coming back as the primary. What's going on? So it wasn't working. I went and I replicated the problem, and I kept checking everything over and over, and it was just very subtle issue where in the read-only routing URL, it was actually on the primary, it was actually set to the secondary. So it was confused, and so it would just route to the primary every time. So I wound up just changing that read-only routing URL for the primary, and we already had everything else set up correctly where the primary was set to go to the replica on read-only and as its first option, then fall back to the primary, and then vice versa on the secondary. So very subtle problem. If you're having a problem with read-only routing, scrutinize your primary routing URL very closely. You might find the same issue that I ran into. So the next problem here is with ODI merge customization. So I'm working on a project doing some ETL work. We're primarily trying to do some performance tuning on a lot of mappings that are already done. So if you're not really familiar, ODI is a tool, it's an ETL tool specific to Oracle. And what it does is it basically allows you to define mappings from source to target. And it's got a lot of advanced functionality in it. And then what it really does is generate SQL for you. So these mappings use these things called knowledge modules in order to generate the various SQL. So knowledge modules are just sort of like templates that generate the SQL, and there's different types of them. So in this case, there was a complex mapping that we have from disparate sources, and we're trying to merge into one gigantic pivot table. And what the optimization we're trying to put in is so that when we go to the sources, we're only pulling data since the last run of the ETL. So we've got timestamp columns that are sitting in the target pivot table, and we're able to go to those and get basically the maximum value. So we're trying to so basically, let's say that this mapping ran yesterday, which was December 2nd. And so now we go to our pivot table, we get December 2nd out, and now we go to our sources and say, well, give me everything that's changed since December 2nd. The problem we had is that since we're going to several sources, we need to be able to merge all these things together. There's outer joins going on in the end of the mappings. And so when you do the outer joins, if you got null values from any of the sources and then you tried to merge them into your end target table, you could wind up overwriting those values with nulls. So in order to optimize this mapping, we needed to have something in place so that we were actually using the NVL operator so that we could check the value that we're merging in. And if it's null, we just retain the value in the target table. But there was no knowledge module in ODI that had this functionality. So we had to basically go in and copy an existing knowledge module, the one we were using for the merge, And then we had to figure out how to get that NVL included in the sequel. And it was a difficult task because I didn't really understand. It's got its own language and its own tokens that it uses. But finally got a hold of someone who had a little more experience with ODI than I do. And we sat down and knocked it out. And now we're generating the correct mapping, and we've got the NVL operators in there. And that really allows us to go back into the mapping and then put in those filters so that we're only pulling from the sources since the last run, which should cut down the runtime substantially. So the next client problem that I worked on here was I had a client call up and said they're having timeouts when they run a certain process. It's happening kind of on a weekly basis. And so they're trying to track down, what is the issue? So I hadn't worked on this system in, probably about 6 to 8 months where they haven't a similar problem before. And so they're running this weekly process and getting timeouts. So I had to basically go in and do a quick health check on the system, and I pulled the performance reports to get the total IO and just kind of get the top 10 queries that are running on the system. And I've got a video that I talk about doing using these SSS performance reports, and that gave me a little clue as to maybe some of the inefficiencies in the system. I also installed a blocking lock monitor. So I've got a store procedure and some tables that I installed that go in, and you could run, set a schedule, create a job. And so it goes out and scans the system every, 5 minutes or whatever you want. And it figures out what blocking locks are occurring at that one point in time, and you could set a threshold in there, whatever you want, any blocking locks longer than 3, 5 seconds, and then basically record that to a table so that we can keep an eye on things and just kind of record what's happening in terms of blocking. I also ran SP Blitz on the system just to go through and get the just a basic analysis of the system. SP Blitz runs hundreds of queries and reports back with problems that it finds. And then I looked at the actual stored procedure that was experiencing the timeouts. And I did notice that they had told me that nothing really else is running at the time that they're running this process. And so I looked at the procedure and I noticed that it seemed that it could be a case where SQL Server was trying to paralyze the operations because it was just a big insert statement that was going on, basically moving data from one table to another. And so I have seen in the past where operations like this wind up blocking themselves. So the SQL Server will parallelize the operation. So you have multiple threads working at the same time, and you get these little mini periods of contention where they're all blocking each other just for little milliseconds at a time, but it really adds up over time. So I had them add a max stop directive in the insert statement at the very end where it was doing the select. And then we had the option of max stop at the end. Now we actually ran through the procedure this week and we didn't have the timeout. So I don't know for sure if the issue was the maxed out, but it seems like it may have been it. I also looked at the output of the blocking locks during this period and saw very little actual blocking. And I think I had a threshold for 3 seconds. So we're hoping to see if that solved their problem. If it did, success. Okay, next one here. I've got had a request to enhance a function in a system. So basically, we're getting in like client information and their basic like diagnostic information about individuals. In this case, there was three values we were looking for. Homeless was one of them, and then these are just abbreviations: SMI and SUD, and they needed to be converted into codes. So, for example, Z123 might be for homeless, and Z124 might be for SMI. And these are codes that need to be sent back out to another system. And they needed to be converted into a CSV format. So they're coming in, an individual might have homeless SMI or SUD, and they're coming in, they need to be converted. And if an individual has more than one of these, because we have multiple sources of where the information is coming in, they all need to be concatenated and put into a CSV format. So they need to be combined into CSV values. So For example, let's say you've got Z123 and Z124, and then you've got another set that came in that's Z124 and one Z125. You want the distinct set of these. You don't want 124 coming in twice. So you want to have 123, 124, and 125 as your output with no duplicates in there. And what I wound up doing for this is pulling in the data, doing the conversion of these values into their corresponding codes, and then using a pivot function in order to get Oracle to first put the values, if they came in as a CSV, split them out into individual values, get the distinct set of them, and then compare to them to a pivoted set of these values, and then get that distinct set, and then concatenate it all back together. So it was basically an exercise of going in, parsing values, converting them, and then using Oracle Pivot in order to find out the distinct strings that you're dealing with, and then searching through them and seeing if they're in the set. If they're not, add them. So this is what this looks like. So basically, I was going to the raw table, and this is where the conversion's happening. So basically, converting homeless to a z this basically this string. It's just a code. Same thing with SMI, SUD, and high utilizer. It just becomes some code. And then what happens is we're getting the distinct set of these. So if they're duplicated, we're not going to have more than one. And then we're unpivoting that set, and you have to give it the list of values. This needs to be discrete listing of values that you're unpivoting. And then I'm just going through, it's just got a cursor that's going to loop through each of them, and it's going to see if it's not in there already. That's what the not like is doing in the list. And then all it does is append it if it's not in there. And this is just special code here for cases for the first one you're adding versus if it's null, then you need to add it with a comma at after that code that you're adding. Otherwise, you don't need one. You don't need that comma. So just a little bit different logic with whether it's the first one in the list or it's not the first one. Okay, and the last thing I was going to go over from this week was I had a situation where I had to restore some data. So we noticed that we were missing some data in a table, and so we do daily data pump exports to the database, and we keep those around for quite a bit of time, like couple of weeks. So we actually found out that, hey, you know what? It looks like data was removed from this table the day after Thanksgiving, which was November 25th. So just went and I pulled the export from that day. And so I didn't want to overlay the table that we had. I wanted to be able to create or basically restore to a work table so that I could compare and make sure that the data I was recovering was in fact valid. So basically, this is the syntax. So for data pump, and in this case, I'm just logging in this sysdba. I'm telling it what table that I want to restore, and I need to give it, of course, the dump file that's got the export. So there's your dump file name, and then data pump requires you to specify a directory object, which is a logical mapping to where the data file is sitting on the operating system. And then you can, in order to restore it to a new name, you need to use this remap table operation. So what it's going to do is it's going to go to the schema, which is master in this case, and it's going to get my table from the export file, and it's going to restore it as my table, and then I put a date on the end of it. And since I was restoring to 1125, I figured it made sense to put that as the suffix of the table name. That does it for this video. I appreciate you guys watching. Hey, let me know if this is something you'd like to see more of, or if you think it's something you don't like. Hey, let me know that too. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. If you liked the video, hey, give it a like. Give me some comments. Give me some questions. If anything here sparked a question in your mind, please let me know, and I'll try and do a video for you. Thanks. Bye.